What's going on, everybody? It is that time again. The Sooners Illustrated Podcast, episode 141 on this Thursday, January 2nd, 2025, the first show of 2025. Josh Callaway, Collin Kennedy with you on a Thursday. We have good news to talk about today, which is rare as of late for Oklahoma football. Some key pieces of that OU defense that was much improved in 2024 have announced that they will be back in 2025. Collin and I will react and get into what that defense could look like in Brent Venables' fourth season in Norman. We'll also, of course, hit the defensive coordinator search a little bit. It's been, about a week now since Zach Alley left Oklahoma, a little less than a week. Where do things kind of stand with his replacement? We'll discuss that a little bit as well. And we'll dive into some of the latest in the transfer portal. Sooners have made a couple more additions since Monday's show, and we'll talk about those guys as well as maybe some potential additions coming up down the road. Right guy to ask here with Collin Kennedy, of course, in the latest in the transfer portal. But CK, let's get going and start with the team for next year. I talked about it with some good news, which is welcomed Oklahoma. Obviously, the big return of a few weeks ago was Deion Burks announcing his comeback for the offensive side. Defensively, we've had some big additions here in the last week. Damonic Williams and Robert Spears-Jennings both announcing they will be back with Oklahoma next season. Obviously, Damonic Williams was one that a lot of fans were very curious about. Probably could have made the jump to the NFL. He wanted to. There was questions, would they be able to lure him back for another year? He is going to be back. Robert Spears-Jennings, who you assume is going to kind of take over the mantle of Oklahoma's go-to safety with Billy Bone moving on. He announces he's going to be back as well. Talk about just, obviously it's a big deal, but this OU defense is shaping up really, really nicely. This was two big wins for Oklahoma, in the portal in a sense, to get these guys to stick and keep them around for another year.
Yeah, I think you're talking about two things. I think you're talking about two really dynamic players and skill sets relative to what this system wants to do, right? I think Robert Spears-Jennings, Damonic Williams, from the defensive tackle spot up to the safeties, what they're asked to accomplish within this Brent Venables defense, both of these players meant a lot to that side of the ball. But on top of that, you're also talking about two leaders, two vocal presences that you really want to have back going into 2025, guys that I think will command a lot of attention and will earn the respect of their peers continuously.
Mm-hmm.
They already have, but I think, like you mentioned, Robert Spears-Jennings was looked at as someone who could probably take over sort of that Billy Bowman role. And Damonic Williams, since he's come in, everyone raves about the job that he's done both on the field and off the field. Very much welcome news. And I think Robert Spears-Jennings, I really like this in terms of him coming back because he's probably one of your most versatile safeties. I know there was a game, I believe it was the Tennessee game, where he played all the way up from the high safety down to the line of scrimmage, positioned as like an edge rusher at one point. And
yeah,
he can cover, he can play the zone, he can rush the passer a little bit. He's effective stopping the run at the second level. I'm a really big fan of Robert Spears-Jennings. We've talked about this several times.
Mm-hmm.
I think he is a perfect fit for what they want to do. And to have someone like that back not only gives you a chess piece that they really need, but it also gives you a leader to turn towards, especially because you're kind of ushering in Peyton Bowen as that other primary presence at safety. And then Damonic Williams, we've talked about this as well a little bit, but just to reiterate, I've had a lot of people ask me, hey, was all the effort, the time spent, and let's just be honest, the money, was it worth the pursuit of Damonic Williams? I think it was. I think that there were moments this past season where if you were watching Damonic Williams, keeping a close eye, he came in and I thought, okay, maybe he's going to play a lot of like three technique, penetrate, be more of a one gapper, get after the quarterback or attack running lanes and create tackles for loss. Most of the time this year, he was playing more like the nose shade one, being asked to kind of two gap, hold at the point of attack, maintain physicality. And I thought, man, he really played that role well, especially because I think there's an argument out there that maybe that's not his ideal role relative to his skill set. But, man, he did it well. I thought I believe it was Texas, that game where he almost immediately knocked people off the ball. And you're like, man, Dominic Williams he can't go underappreciated. And there were a few moments this past year where I caught Dominic Williams out of the corner of my eye, blowing up the line of scrimmage. And so, again, really talented players, but also vocal presences and leaders you needed to have back. And I think Oklahoma's getting ready to lean on these two a lot going into 2025.
Yeah, no, Damonic Williams was really good. And, a lot of fans, especially from other fan bases, will kind of point to the numbers. Numbers don't tell the whole story with defensive tackle in particular. I mean,
correct.
Oklahoma, their run defense was a strength of the team all year. One of the better run defenses, obviously, in the SEC and the country. Damonic Williams is a huge part of that. And Robert Spears-Jennings, I really love him as a player. He's got a ton of upside. He's got an NFL future ahead of him. Another year, I think, is the right move for him. And obviously, Oklahoma welcomes him back. That's a great safety room with him at the top, and then Peyton Bowen, and then all those young guys we've talked about a few times: Jaden Hardy, Michael Boganowski, Reggie Powers. I mean, that's a position that's in good shape, even with losing a guy like Billy Bowman. I want to ask you this, because I couldn't help but, I'm looking at the defense on paper. Now, so we don't know about R. Mason Thomas. That's the other big one that's floating out there. We've mentioned a few times things have sounded positive there. Oklahoma has remained confident that they'll have R. Mason Thomas back next year, but nothing official yet. There was the one Oklahoma, they put out the graphic, then they deleted it. There's been all that kind of, I know fans are on the edge of their seat waiting for that decision to be made public. But for the sake of conversation, I wanted to bring it up to you because you look at this defense, and I know you're losing Danny Stutzman, who is, you can't downplay that. And Billy Bowman, DeJoun Terry on the defensive line, Ethan Downs on the edge. Like, you're losing some big-time guys. But, man, this defense on paper is it looks like it's got a chance to be so good next year. I mean, with Damonic Williams back, Dominic, Jay Jackson, true freshman All-American, David Stone year 2, Grayson Alton, who had a great year, is back. That linebacker room, you got Kip Lewis and Kobe McKenzie. Samuel Masigo played really quality snaps. You're assuming Kendall Dolby will be back and healthy. Eli Bowen in the cornerback room. Hopefully you can keep Gentry Williams on the field. I just talked about that safety room. This defense, man, it's got a chance to be really good again. Is it crazy to think this defense could be maybe even better next year than it was this year? Where are you kind of at with this defense now? Again, we're still waiting on Mason Thomas, which is a huge fish in this thing, but for you, this defense looks like it's got a chance to be really salty on paper, which is exciting for Oklahoma. It's something to look forward to for next year.
Well, look, why don't you just say it with your chest, Josh? Because I can see through the question. What do you think? Is this defense going to be better than this past season's group?
If R. Mason Thomas is back, yes, I think so. I think it's going to be. I mean, I'm looking at this thing saying, like, where are the holes? And they could still use some additions over there. And we talked about it, or we will talk about it later on in the show. Probably could use an edge, maybe a linebacker with Lewis Carter moving on, but
corner
probably wouldn't hurt because, like we said, Gentry Williams has been so good, but he's had problems staying on the field. I think this group's got a chance to be really, really good. And you're kind of looking at it like, man, if the offense can just not be a black hole like it was this year, they might be, like, believe it or not, Oklahoma might be okay next year, which is not the popular sentiment right now, certainly. I don't know. Maybe that's a bit misguided, but I'm looking at this defense on paper, looking at the depth and just kind of saying this looks really like it's in good shape.
Yeah, I think it's contingent upon a couple of things, kind of like you mentioned, R. Mason Thomas's decision. I think further portal additions are going to be huge in terms of trying to match the level of play we saw Oklahoma on that side of the ball in 2024, because I think you mentioned it, Ethan Downs to me is a very significant loss. I don't know that I got enough time to acknowledge his efforts in that game against Navy. He played his butt off in his.
He didn't have to play in.
Yeah, he did a really nice job. Trace Ford really kind of came on this year.
For sure.
So you're losing some production at defensive end. Caden Woolard as well is a key loss. The cornerback position is interesting to me. And I don't want to obviously overlook not only Danny Stutzman, like you mentioned, but losing Billy Bowman is tough. Kendall Dolby returning a full season of him, if he's 100% coming back, we'll see. I think that is something that could elevate this group. I think another year for not only guys like Kip Lewis and Kobe McKenzie, but I think Samuel Mosigo's got a chance to be a really darn good football player.
Oh, yeah.
I think Eli Bowen.
The door's not closed on Jaren Kanak, too, in that linebacker room. I know people kind of throwing dirt on him a little bit, but.
Right. They have pieces, especially in that front seven, to get it done, even while losing someone like Danny Stutzman. Right. I think that the secondary is going to be the big key for me going into next year. Like, I think that going into this past season, you felt a little bit more sure yourself as far as OU's back end. Going into next season, no Billy Bowman. Obviously, RSJ is RSJ, but is Kendall Dolby going to be back and healthy? Are they going to get those cornerback spots solidified? Is Gentry Williams going to play? I mean, that elevates this unit exponentially because we know he's a very talented player. And if they nail a few more portal additions, which like you said, we'll get to that in a second, I'm not there yet like you are, but I also don't think your take is too outlandish because there is certainly a world where Brent Venables has this unit rolling again in 2025.
Yeah, the corner room is definitely interesting because it's a question of can one of those other young guys rise? You know, can you get a Devin Jordan or maybe a Jeremiah Newcomb?
Yeah,
Jacoby Johnson certainly. If one or two of those guys can be legit, because Eli Bowen was great. He's a freshman All-American this year. Gentry Williams is really, really talented when he's on the field. There's a lot of reasons to be, I think, still optimistic about that room, and we'll see. But it's just kind of a little bit of a reminder. I know it's been a lot of bad, and look, we've talked about it at length. It's been a rough offseason to this point for Oklahoma. But when you kind of look at the actual talent on paper, especially on the defensive side, like it's hard not to look at it and be like, they might be okay. They might be okay. They still got Brett Venables coaching them. He still knows a thing or two about defense. If the offense can just be, at least serviceable, unlike it was this year, they might still be able to win a lot of football games. I think that's fair to say.
They're going to be more than okay. Let's just say it. They're going to be more than okay on the defensive side of the ball. The defense was not the issue. They, in all honesty, should pat themselves on the back for the effort in 2024. I think everyone knows that if they hadn't been put in as many tough positions throughout the year, they look even better statistically because they held strong in some tough spots. Yes, we talked about, I think a big step forward for this defense going into 2025 is getting the stops when you absolutely have to have it. But in general, I think no matter not only who's on the field for them next year, who's coordinating the defense as well, Josh, they're going to be just fine.
Yeah. To say the least. And on that note, let's get into the defensive coordinator search a little bit. So, we're in the early stage of this thing still. Zach Alley left for West Virginia. That was on Saturday. It's Thursday. It feels like it's been even longer than that. So, we didn't really broach too much of the conversation of where Oklahoma could really go as a replacement. We did the instant reaction show last Saturday. We do have our hot board up on Sooners Illustrated. VIP subscribers have had a chance to kind of peruse that, a few days ago. We're continuing to update that, and Collin's been providing more updates on some of the other moves on the staff that could be coming down the road, things like that. But I wanted to kind of get a little check-in with you on the DC search from what you've been kind of hearing. I mean, I know there's a lot of thought that maybe Oklahoma could just keep this thing in-house. We kind of broached that a little bit on the instant reaction. I'm also kind of curious if you have any insight on the timeline of this too. Like, is there a rush to get this done? Not necessarily. It's kind of not really as it's a little bit. It's a different scenario than it was with the offensive coordinator search, where it was like this defensive staff is not going anywhere, so it's not as much of a. I feel like a panic there. Maybe that's a misread on my part, but for you on the defensive coordinator search, just kind of what are some maybe little updates for you on how you see this maybe shaking out and what Oklahoma's kind of looking at, valuing anything as this process kind of continues to unfold?
Yeah, I think as far as the timeline to start, definitely get the sense that Oklahoma would prefer to have this wrapped up over the next few days. I think that once Zach Alley exited, probably the goal time frame was roughly a week to a week and a half, maybe a little bit longer if they saw some opportunities externally to get something done. And kind of on that note, I don't think that there is necessarily a tremendous amount of rush behind the scenes, because I think a lot of folks are saying, okay, let's give ourselves this amount of time. Let's see what's out there. Let's see how the landscape shakes out. And if worst comes to worst, things don't necessarily go the way that we want them to go, we've got more than capable candidates in-house in guys like Brandon Hall and Todd Bates. And I don't think, like you mentioned, number one, those guys are going anywhere. I think Todd Bates, Brandon Hall are very much around for the long haul with Brent Venables, and that's huge. Todd Bates and Brandon Hall, as good as it gets in college coaching, right? Maybe even in general. But on top of that, I think the big outlier is naturally Wes Goodwin, the Clemson defensive coordinator, at least this past season and a few years beyond. There are rumblings that the two parties might be going their separate directions. Now, I haven't seen anything formally announced from Clemson on Wes Goodwin as of current time recording. So we'll see. But I do believe that should someone like Wes Goodwin become open and available, that would make a lot of sense among a few other candidates, because as far as what they're prioritizing, another layer to your question, I think a big thing for this defensive coordinator search, or maybe even lack thereof, if you want to label it that, is simply making sure that Oklahoma is putting someone in that position who can alleviate some of the pressure on Brent Venables. I think you do have to give a tip of the cap to Zach Alley for the job that he did in terms of coming in, being able to be a play caller, call the shots a little bit, give Brent one less thing to worry about, have a lot of say in the game plan, and present ideas that Brent is open to. And in general, just being a voice that can help kind of balance out Brent's efforts, specifically with the defense, compared to his overall management of the program and everything that entails these days. And so OU really wants a guy who can provide something similar to what Zach Alley brought. And I'm not saying they're looking for someone exactly like him, but whether it's a Wes Goodwin or some of the other names that we've thrown out there on the board, I don't think Oklahoma's necessarily looking to shake things up and bring in this hot shot up-and-coming defensive coordinator. They're just looking for someone who can come in and support Brent Venables, help him out while also letting Brent do what he wants to do, so that in a year in 2025 where everything is on the table, Brent can not only feed off of that individual, but feel really good about what's being accomplished on that side of the ball at a time where it absolutely has to get done.
Yeah, there's a middle ground between the last two defensive coordinators that Brent Venables has had. Ted Roof, who was the extreme in one direction, not really. Ted Roof was just kind of like basically Brent's helper, essentially. I mean, he didn't really, I'm trying to find the right way to word without just completely insulting Ted Roof, but he was defensive coordinator in title only. Like, I mean, he didn't call the defense. Brent Venables was the DC those 2 years.
Right.
Last year, Zach Alley was the defense, right? I mean, he called it, it was help Brent Venables' defense at the end of the day, but he was able to lean on Zach a lot more and kind of be more that CEO kind of, like we've talked about, oversee a lot more of the team. And he trusted Zach to be a little more run the show. You're probably not going to find that, in this cycle. Maybe they do, but, I'm assuming not. So finding someone more in the middle ground where it's not a complete, like it's all on Brent, but someone he does trust and know and can lean on, that seems very plausible to me. And those options are in-house, like we just said, with Brandon Hall potentially, or Todd Bates. I mean, James Skalski is on the staff, seems like a very natural linebackers coach if you needed one, if you wanted to go that route. Or if it is Wes Goodwin, that makes sense for the same reasons. I mean, Wes Goodwin, outside of a stint where he left to be with the Arizona Cardinals for a little while, was with Brent that whole stretch in Clemson. I mean, he's been in Clemson a really long time. So those guys know each other. And that's someone that you feel like if they brought in, Brent knows very well, coached with it for a long time. They know what the other guy wants to do. They're on the same wavelength. Like, there's not going to be a lot of learning each other. There's going to be very little. I mean, they've been around each other a lot, over the last decade or so. So that seems like a very natural fit. And again, I know that there's, there's really not anyone in my mind that Oklahoma can bring in that's going to win the PR battle of Zach Alley leaving. But, I think at the end of the day, in this tough spot for Brent Venables, tough spot in his career, tough spot personally, someone he can just trust and feels good about is likely, I think, the way this ends up going. And maybe not, but it just seems like that makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. So whether that's one of the in-house guys or potentially West Goin or maybe somebody else that we haven't brought up, but it all makes sense to me in this spot for Oklahoma. We'll see. And we'll continue to have updates on that over on Sooners Illustrated, Oklahoma247sports.com. Again, the hot board's there. We're going to have more updates as it comes. And whenever the news comes out, best believe we'll be all over it. Probably have an instant reaction show as well for that, I would imagine, whenever that DC hire gets made official. Should we do a little portal?
Let's do it.
Transfer portal, always rolling. It's 2025, and the portal does not stop or care about the calendar. So we keep it moving. Oklahoma's made a couple more additions this week. We'll get into those first, and then we'll look at maybe what's next or left for Oklahoma to accomplish in the portal. Let's start with Josiah Martin, Cal wide receiver, signed on earlier this week. The fourth wide receiver added to the fold along with Giovanni Gibson from Arkansas Pine Bluff, Countez Lewis, of course, from Southern Illinois, and then Isaiah Satania from Arkansas. Josiah Martin comes aboard. Collin, a young guy, just played 1 year at Cal, and he's from down right near your neck of the woods there. He played high school football at Denton Guyer with Jackson Arnold. So It's a guy that I'm assuming you saw in high school at least multiple times, and played 1 year at Cal, did some nice things, had a big touchdown in the bowl game that Cal played just like a week ago. What does Josiah Martin bring to the table? And, unlike maybe the other ones, because he is so young, it doesn't feel like he necessarily has to be an instant impact. He might be, but he's one that you feel like can help you years down the road if you can obviously, continue to develop him and build him up. What does it kind of say about this team now that Josiah Martin is on board, and what do you make of the pickup?
Yeah, I like that this is kind of a blend of immediate contributions versus long-term development, because going into this portal window, I think everyone knew that Oklahoma was going to go hunting for guys they felt could come in and play right away. And Josiah Martin did exactly that. His first year at Cal, played in 7 games, contributed a decent amount for the Golden Bears. A pretty good Golden Bears team, by the way. I want to make sure I throw that in there as well.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that you like about this with Josiah Martin, like you mentioned, he played at Denton Guyer. He is very familiar with the Bowens. He was very familiar with Jackson Arnold. He knows like Zane Rowe. A lot of these Guyer guys, again, a recruiting territory and an institution, if you will, that has been good to OU a few times. Josiah Martin, though, Josh, this is someone who wanted to be at Oklahoma for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important because when you're going through the portal process, are you looking at these guys as a for hire, a mercenary, a grad transfer who's just going to come in, try to earn some cash, increase draft stock, and get out? Or are you looking for guys that take some pride in the program they are now joining? And in Josiah Martin, I do believe that Oklahoma is getting a player who really cares about where he's going, because in his recruiting process, at one point when I came back to the state, I went to Guyer to check in on Eli Bowen. That's when I met Zane Rowe for the first time.
Yeah.
Some of these other Guyer guys. And I texted Josiah Martin at the time and said, hey, I'm coming out to see you. And he was really excited. But when I asked him after practice, hey, how much are you hearing from Oklahoma these days? He was like, man, unfortunately, like, not really at all. Not much going on there. And you could tell that, I don't want to say he was frustrated. He was maybe a little bit disappointed. He really wanted an opportunity to be recruited by a place like Oklahoma. But because you have kind of that familiarity and you have the needs that you have, not just at receiver, but what you're looking for in that room, yes, you need guys who can come in and play, but you also need guys who can come in and play for a little while when you're losing guys like a Jaquez Petaway, a younger piece that you felt really good about at one point. And so there's a lot to like. There are layers about the addition of Josiah Martin that I think are very promising. And you're never going to complain about adding a guy who found his way onto the field as a freshman, but you're also never going to complain about adding a guy, especially at like the skill position spots where, let's just call it what it is, sometimes you get some divas out there.
Yeah.
Josiah Martin cares about getting to put on an Oklahoma uniform, and man, not much more you could ask for in this edition.
Denton Geyer remains a very good program for Oklahoma. It's been very fruitful. So a high school teammate of Eli Bowen, like you mentioned there. Yeah, I mean, just a nice pickup. And like you said, kind of that balance of he gives you depth immediately as a guy you probably could throw out there right away if you needed him to. But also, like, he's got his whole career in front of him. Like, he's only going to get better. And if you can keep him around for the long haul as someone who could be a big contributor for you for a number of years. So nice get here with Josiah Martin.
Yeah, and I wanted to add real quick, too, another thing about him, like you mentioned, a guy who can at least provide some depth. I think another thing that you have to really like is this is a guy who his first year of college ball showcased a little bit of versatility as well. Obviously, they're looking for a lot of different receivers, but you're talking about a guy who played, according to PFF, about 83 snaps in the slot, 56 snaps on the perimeter, so can do a little inside-out action and even spend some time in the backfield. He has caught the ball and also had some opportunities to carry the football. And so on top of everything we just talked about in terms of the depth piece, like you mentioned, it doesn't hurt either to get a guy who not only can come in and play, he can do whatever you're asking him to do. And when you're able to showcase that versatility early on, Oklahoma's going to be able to find a way to get this guy on the field, and you know he's going to be excited to do that.
For sure. And like we said, again, in the bowl game against a good UNLV team, just whenever that was, a week or two ago, 4 catches for 40 yards, and he had a 29-yard touchdown run. I mean, a true freshman. I mean, just a little, just talking about a couple weeks ago, not like 3 years ago. I mean, this just happened. So a lot to like there, a lot of upside with Josiah Martin. Be a fun one to get our eyes on here coming up in the spring and down the road. Elsewhere on the transfer side, on the addition front, they picked up a kicker today. Oklahoma signed a kicker, Austin Welch from Kennesaw State. That is the third transfer from Kennesaw State. So the Owls program is being very good to Oklahoma. Doug Deacon back on the board here again. We knew they needed a kicker. Zach Schmidt and Tyler Keltner both moving on as their careers came to an end. You have the true freshman Liam Evans, obviously aboard the local kid who people are very excited about. But, you still needed more options. You want to have a competition, obviously. You figure Austin Welch will be right in the mix for that job. Did some good things at Kennesaw State this year. I think he was 14 of 18 on field goals. I think he hit 49-yarder was his long, something like that. So he's a veteran guy. This is his 5th year of college football next year. So he comes in, you figure, can be right in the mix as a potential starting kicker for you next year. Collin, anything to put in here as far – we knew Oklahoma needed a kicker, and they went out and they got one here with Doug Deacon hitting on Kennesaw State, again, just like he did for the punter.
Kennesaw State Sooners, man. It's impressive, a little bit of the pipeline being drawn. Look, Oklahoma missed out on one of the top kickers available in this portal window. Lucas Carnerio visited, but ended up going to Ole Miss. We know what Ole Miss is willing to do in the portal to build its roster. And so pretty nice pivot point. I thought a pretty good note from our own Tom Green on the board today. Kennesaw State 9th in the FBS in special teams efficiency this season. So Doug Deacon doing his homework, man. He's finding some gems. And I think the other thing too with Austin Welch, Jacob Ulrich, Austin, Carson Kent, I know that singularly all these transfer portal additions, everyone looks at them kind of in a vacuum, and you're asking, okay, what can this guy do? Is he a starter at a place like Oklahoma? But the portal window serves you for depth as much as it does starters as well. And Austin Welch is going to come in, and maybe he's the starting kicker. Maybe he's just a mentor to, like you mentioned, the young promising talent that they have already in place. I don't know, but you address a need, and I think you address a need with a veteran presence. It's hard to complain about a place kicker right now.
For sure. You needed one. You went and you got one. We'll see how it pans out. You never know. Sometimes you get a kicker and you think it's a slam dunk and doesn't really pan out. Other times you don't. You're not crazy about it. And They come in and they rock. It's kind of one of those hard positions to really know what to expect. So we'll see. But also, Welch, you figure at the very least is going to be in the mix of the starting kicker job. And I don't think it would surprise anybody if he's kicking field goals week 1 next year. So
look, if this is the last time that we talk about Austin Welch, then he probably did a pretty good job, right? So that's all you're asking. Let this be your first and last appearance pretty much on the Sooners Illustrated podcast.
100%. As far as what's left for Oklahoma in the portal, so they've added 12 portal guys. Now, remember, Brent Venables originally said 8 to 12. Now, he was flexible on that. And it sounds like they're going to go north of that number. Guys are at 12, 10 guys on offense, and then the 2 specialists who we just talked about with Ulrich and Welch, both from Kennesaw State. So nobody on defense yet. 12 guys in still. Nobody on the defensive side. I want to ask about that in a second, but let me first, on the offensive side, anything left? I mean, they've added 4 receivers now, 2 tight ends, a couple of tackles, obviously the quarterback, which was a must-have in John Mateer, and another quarterback in Cole Gonzalez from Western Carolina. Is there anything else offensively that you think that they're going to look at to add? Obviously, no running backs added yet. They also haven't lost any running backs, so I don't know if they're going to need one. Is there another position that you think that Oklahoma could look to still supplement or add more to in the portal?
Yeah, I do. I think there's some possibilities here, even though I think obviously it's a pretty complete and well-rounded haul on that side of the ball in terms of addressing some of the needs. I think they're pretty much capped at wide receiver unless there's someone that you just can't say no to.
Sure.
Or maybe some more turnover hits that room. I think running back, not necessarily in the same boat, but pretty similar. Like if you lose a body, then maybe the spring portal window is where you see an addition. Sure. I look at tight end where we know they are still going after other players at that position. Yes, they've added 2 to this point, but we noted it on the board the other night and then kind of official today. John Locke, the Louisiana Tech transfer tight end. John Locke locking it up with his Oklahoma offer. And, man, that would be pretty electric in terms of the touchdown call from Toby Rowland, you'd have to think. But anyways, he gets his offer today, Josh, and talking to John a little bit before he got the offer, seems like a great guy. 6'4" to 6'5", 250 pounds. Not necessarily a ton of receiving production here either, but it sounds like he's a pretty well-rounded player who really cares about the run blocking aspect as well. And as we've talked about, yes, you want someone that can provide volume in the passing game, but as was made very evident this past season, you needed someone in the tight end position who could help you in some of these run schemes. They are certainly trying to find guys who can do that. And maybe John Locke is the next in line. We'll see. I know he has several other offers to this point, and so I'm hoping to catch up with him pretty soon. But the last thing I want to mention on John Locke, talking to him, he was very excited that there was buzz about him around Oklahoma. He was like, really? You really think they're interested? And I was like, you just told me they're talking to you. Like, yeah, man. So he cares. He's very excited about the Oklahoma offer, and we'll see if OU can pick it up. And then I think I've said this before, offensive line.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if they added another body there in the portal window. We'll see. I know that part of that is pretty contingent upon who, if anyone, leaves. And that's not just obviously around this time. I mean, the portal window is pretty much closed, but I think people need to remember the spring window is still very relevant, especially in terms of offensive linemen, because you go in as a talented offensive lineman in the spring portal window, I mean, you're commanding the market. And so I think Oklahoma could potentially look to add another frontliner, just seeing the way things shake out over the next few months. And so that'd be my overview of the offensive side of the ball right now. And while they pretty much have that side and the specialists wrapped up, maybe there's some room for further growth out of the portal.
For sure. And we talked about that tight end room. It would make sense probably to add another body. It's a position that needs help. I mean, it hasn't really been a strength for Oklahoma the last couple of years. So the more bodies, really, the better. And hopefully you can hit on 1 or 2 of them and see if that position can turn around a little bit for you, going into 2025. Like I mentioned, defensively, they have not added anyone in the portal, which is kind of crazy. But, I mean, like we talked about earlier, I mean, the defense has got a lot of talent still on it, even with the guys who are moving on. And the portals you have had. Not a ton, but some. Obviously, saw McCullough in there, Makari Vickers, another one in that cornerback room. Do you envision Oklahoma making some pickups in the defensive side, in this window? Maybe not till after the spring. Where are you kind of at on the defensive side of it? Because it is kind of, obviously the defense we just talked about is in a great place for next year. It was not a problem this year. It's all about the offense. So rightfully so, that's where the focus has been. But it's kind of crazy. We're into January and we're still waiting for our first defensive portal addition. Where are they at defensively for you? And could you see maybe some movement here before, this window is over, this cycle, and maybe revisit this back in after the spring?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty good illustration of where things are at, because you and I haven't even really had a chance to talk about this, but it is kind of the mood of the fan base right now. It may almost get forgotten that they're willing to take guys on the defensive side of the ball just because of all the chatter that was on the offensive side. And now you're sitting here coming out of the portal window being closed in the winter, and you're like, well, if they were going to add bodies, wouldn't that have been done by now? And that's not necessarily for lack of effort. I want to tip the cap to OU's defensive staff, especially with stuff that's going on with Zach Alley's transition and everything. They have been involved with guys. Now, they've missed on a few, and that's going to happen, especially because you're dealing with portal players. They went after a couple defensive tackles, didn't get them. They are still involved with some previous visitors that got to campus on the defensive side of the ball but didn't shut things down and are still open. And that's kind of where I want to start. I'm going to go top down here a little bit. Safety, I don't really see them touching that room. We've talked about this, I think, on the podcast, by the way. Like, why would you mess up what you got going on for Brandon Hall and that group?
Not a really much reason to. No.
Yeah, not only are you top heavy, but the young up-and-comers at safety, leave that alone. Let those guys thrive. and it sounds like they are. Corner is really big deal. I think for me, it's kind of been the most important but under-discussed storyline for OU in the portal to this point, because I think it was pretty apparent, if there was maybe a liability in that defense, it was on the perimeter. It was cornerback. And you saw the portal taketh a little bit at that position. So will it provide? Ethan O'Connor has still kind of been the name that's floated out there. And I can't remember the last time we talked about him. So a quick refresher, Ethan O'Connor, Washington State cornerback, played early and often in his very young career at Wazoo, was going to go to UCLA out of high school, was pretty coveted as a recruit, but some things off the field led him to Wazoo. And so Ethan O'Connor visited Oklahoma, and it almost felt like at one point they were going to get that done. But then he visits Miami. He visits Georgia. I believe he got to Colorado as well. Anyway, Ethan O'Connor at corner is still the name. I can't recall another offer that's gone out at cornerback in the portal to this point. But last I spoke with some folks the other day, I believe this was yesterday even, Georgia feels like the big cloud hanging over this portal recruitment. If Georgia is going to go all in on Ethan O'Connor, it feels like a lot of programs acknowledge the fact that's probably a pretty realistic partnership. But then I know Miami is still very interested in Ethan O'Connor, even despite adding, I believe, 2 cornerbacks to this point via the portal, which is interesting. I think that speaks to the player he is. And then obviously on the Oklahoma front, I think it's pretty apparent this is their top target if they haven't sent out another portal offer at corner. Linebacker, Kendall Daniels is starting to come back up, folks. Here we go again. We're riding a roller coaster
that's a fun
with Kendall Daniels. And we'll see. I do believe he will be visiting Oklahoma very soon, very, very soon. And I think in very much Kendall Daniels fashion, he visited Penn State, I believe, a week ago, and Penn State felt really good. And then again, just the way Kendall Daniels kind of rides, he left campus and Penn State had no idea where they stood. They were like, I think we did a good job. And then someone mentioned to me, I haven't been able to confirm this, but someone mentioned to me that Alabama kind of got in the mix, but wasn't able to get him on campus. I have to follow up on that, but apparently there were talks of that, and that didn't really come to fruition. So Kendall Daniels is Kendall Danielsing, but he's a really, really good football player, and he'd be an ideal fit for this defense. I think Oklahoma's getting ready to kind of sink its teeth into that one.
Good cheat
over the next few days,
right?
Oh man, I mean, you gotta think if that guy potentially becomes your replacement for Dasan McCullough, that's a true win, right? In terms of skill set replicated,
for sure.
Then you move down to the defensive line. They are in the mix, hot and heavy for edge rushers and defensive ends. So as we're getting ready to record, this had kind of been rumored. We talked about this a little bit on the board, but then our own Matt Zenitz put it out publicly. Marvin Jones Jr., speaking of another familiar name, he will visit Oklahoma. And speaking with sources, this is an interesting one. A former 5-star recruit has gone from Georgia to Florida State and now back in the portal. I know Oklahoma has been interested in Marvin Jones Jr. for a long time, since he was a recruit. And I think Oklahoma was in his top 5 or whatever. But I think Oklahoma has to play the situation delicately because on one hand, you have Marvin Jones Jr. You also have a few other big-name edge rushers looking at the program currently. I believe William Whitlow Jr. out of Memphis is another name. I think he's visiting very soon. Talented player, had a lot of production at Memphis from what I can recall. And then Maurice Westmoreland from UTEP. Spoke with sources very close to him. There's a lot of interest in Oklahoma from what I can gather. Now, getting a visit on the books is imperative. And then, in general, kind of feeling things out in terms of this, for lack of a better term, defensive end board in the portal. I don't know how they are going to see this because Westmoreland is someone a lot of programs really like. Whitlow is in the same vein. And then obviously Marvin Jones Jr. is the name Marvin Jones Jr. So to round it out, defensive tackle, I still think they'll take one. I still think if they can find an ideal fit at defensive tackle, they would like to replace someone like DeJoun Terry. And I know the name that's been thrown out there a time or two is Trey Williams. He was at Clemson.
Yeah.
Big dude. And I believe Todd Bates recruited him. I need to look back on that. I've had a few things going on. But if the Wes Goodwin thing comes to fruition as well, who knows? I mean, maybe that becomes a pretty seamless transition for him. But at the same time, you're talking about a big name defensive tackle. You just never know with those kind of guys. They could pretty much pick whoever they want out of the litter. So they're going to add on the defensive side of the ball. That's going to happen, and that's kind of been the goal. That's been the mission. It's just it's a journey. And not only is it about getting the guys, it's about getting the right guys to enter a unit where you really feel good about who you already have in place. And we'll see how they figure things out over the next week or so, because I do think some big additions will be entering the fold here pretty soon.
Yeah, and it kind of feels like, the offense was the priority, which makes sense to start. And it's like you got your quarterback, you got a bunch of receivers, you've hit some tight ends, offensive line, and now it's like it kind of feels like, all right, let's get some defensive bodies in here now. It's almost like the focus has shifted a little bit. I want to ask you real quick, too. You mentioned the edge rushers. Does the R. Mason Thomas thing, what impact does that have? I mean, can you see them? Are they going to take one, you think, either way? Would they take more than one if R. Mason Thomas does jump? How does that, wrinkle add to it?
It's a really good question. I think it would change more externally than internally because on one hand, I do believe Oklahoma wants to take one or two edge guys because losing Ethan Downs and Trace Ford and Caden Woolard, I think PJ Adebaware is expected to take a jump, but he's still, as we saw in the Navy game, he's still jumping, like you mentioned. To lose that type of production, to lose that veteran experience that they had in kind of that trio at defensive end, I don't know that it would change much in-house in terms of their pursuit of the position. But another layer to the question, because it's a good one, maybe R. Mason Thomas returning changes things for these guys that they're going after because, I mean, that's a surefire starter locking his place back up. And would that kind of alter their perspective of the opportunity at a place like Oklahoma, especially when like some names that are hovering around these guys, Nebraska, throwing a ton of money around right now. I think like Michigan State, a few others, maybe that alters the path that not only the program takes, but these players take as they're evaluating OU. It's definitely not only an outlier for next year's team at Oklahoma, but it's an outlier in terms of what they're able to accomplish maybe with the remainder of the portal window.
For sure. And that defensive ends room in a very interesting place, because our Mason Thomas, if he's back, I mean, obviously you're looking at, another massive year in store for him. But then, PJ Adebawore, can he start to live up to all that potential he had as a, 5-star prospect? And then you have all those year 2 guys, just a bunch of them. Danny O, of course, Daniel Okoye, who we both love, and Wyatt Gilmore, guy who I think also doesn't get a lot of shine is Taylor Wine is another one I think a little bit forgotten about from a public perception sometimes. That guy, from being down the field, he's got all the look, right? I mean, he's a big dude. So that room's an interesting spot. You're going to be relying possibly on some young guys to make a jump for you, probably no matter what. But if you get Art Mason back and you make a portal pickup, that position's right back to being really, really loaded again, even though you just lost, Ethan Downs and those other guys you mentioned. All right, I think that's it. Good show. Portal never stops. We'll be back next week. Obviously, by that time, there'll be a whole bunch of more portal stuff to talk about. Oklahoma continuing to get things straightened out with the defensive coordinator search. Like we said, Sooners Illustrated, more updates there as that continues to unfold. That probably is going to get solidified sooner rather than later. And also keep up with all the latest in the portal, all that good stuff over on Oklahoma247sports.com. Become a VIP subscriber. Keep up with all the latest intel there. We'll be back next week for the Sooners Illustrated podcast on Monday with Tom and James as we get full into the portal and offseason. Obviously, basketball continue to roll on. SEC play starting for the Hoops teams this weekend, so a lot to pay attention to there as well. We'll recap that on Monday. Collin, appreciate you as always. We'll catch up with you again next week. We also might have the debut maybe of our new pickup next Thursday, potentially. You want to take a shot at it with the –
And Kobiak. Yeah, I think that's how you say it. Yeah, excited to welcome Blake and Kobiak to Sooners Illustrated, a new staff member for the team, and a guy who is from the state of Oklahoma, grew up an Oklahoma fan, is going to expand our recruiting coverage. And on that note, folks, as we get out of here, today is the last day of 50% off subscriptions. The last day, midnight tonight. You will no longer be able to get your subscription to Sooners Illustrated for half off. I encourage you to capitalize on it because everything that Josh mentioned, it's not slowing down. We just bring in a new team member for further coverage to bring to you guys. And on top of that, all this stuff, portal, coaching changes, all this, the recruiting stuff still exists, by the way. And I'm getting ready to spend an entire week in San Antonio next week at the Navy All-American Bowl. There's going to be like 8 to 10 guys just playing in the game alone that I'm getting ready to talk to about OU and all that. All that coverage is coming. The National Combine is that week as well, where a lot of targets across several classes for OU will be around. I'll talk to them. Recruiting coverage still exists, folks, and that's certainly coming as well. So 50% off. Feel free to join us, and we'll continue to cover it all going into next week and beyond.
Not to mention winter workouts are starting soon, and then spring camp. I mean, it never stops. We keep it rolling, right? And then we'll be back ready for next season before you know it. But yeah, like we said, next Thursday we're back with Collin and probably the debut of our new Blake and Kobiak, who's going to be awesome for us. He's going to be a big pickup for us. I'm excited to get him going. He's already making moves already for us. So great time to jump aboard as Sooners Illustrated got better this week. So keep up with us and more to come. That's it for now. Back on Monday for Collin Kennedy. I'm Josh Callaway signing off. We'll see you next time right back here on the Sooners Illustrated podcast.